Welcome back. I'm really looking forward to this chapter on Spring Social because it's going to be a chance to have some fun with social media. Spring Social could easily be a course in its own right, but the reason that I'm doing it here is that we can use Spring Social to achieve single sign-on. So we'll start with an overview of single sign-on and why you might want to support it. The kind of single sign-on that we're studying here is for public-facing websites. If you need to do this for private intranet-based applications, then you will want enterprise sign-on, which we will be covering later in the course. Anyway, let's get started. In this chapter, we're just going to experiment and have some fun with Spring Social, and it will be the next chapter when we integrate it with Spring Security. I'm sure you've all used a website which supports SSO. Just in case, I'll do a very quick review of what SSO is all about. And this is where a website, and I've just chosen a random website here. This is called Strava.com. It's a site where athletes and cyclists record their activities. I hope Strava don't mind me using them as an example. It's a really popular and well-developed site. And the idea is that if I'm a new user to Strava, I can choose. I can either go down the traditional route of supplying my details, including an email and password, or as a courtesy, really, Strava allow me to also sign up using my Facebook account or my Google account. And this is supposed to be better for me as a user. Instead of having to think up a password and having to remember that password, I don't need to do that at all. I would just click on the sign up with Facebook link. That's taking me to my Facebook page, which I'm already logged into. Now, if I hadn't been logged into that page, then I would be asked to log into Facebook as normal. And Facebook are saying, are you happy for us to share the following information with this, what I'm going to call client application, the client of Strava? Are you happy for us to send your public profile and your email address? Now, I actually already have an account with Strava, so I won't continue here, but if I press cancel, but what would have happened if I'd continued with the process there, instead of having to fill in a form like this, Strava will probably be able to get my first name and last name from Facebook. I'll explain why I say probably a little bit later on in the course, but what they definitely will be able to get is some kind of unique identifier that Facebook have assigned to me. It will actually probably be my Facebook ID. What Strava can then do is they can create a record for me in their user database, and that record will be keyed on my Facebook ID. So if you like, there's no authentication going on here on Strava if we use this approach. Instead, Strava are asking Facebook to authenticate me, and then Facebook return back to this site and they tell Strava who I am. So Strava have decided to integrate with Facebook and Google, but you'll find that all of the major social network providers, Twitter, LinkedIn, SoundCloud, and many, many, many more, all support this as a feature that, as developers, we're free to integrate with. If you're planning on supporting this feature on the site, I would hope that you would also offer an alternative, regular, traditional username and password-based login as well. I know that some sites are starting to only provide single sign-on. I'm not sure how many users actually want to do this. I think a lot of users prefer the traditional approach. Before I go on, I will have said this in the introduction to this chapter, but if you're going to be building an internal application that's only going to be used privately inside a company, then there's a very good chance that using Facebook, Google, Twitter, and so on would not be appropriate for that requirement. In that case, we would probably also want to have control over the authenticating site as well. So in that situation, you would use an enterprise single sign-on solution. And later on in this course, we will be covering a service called CAS, Central Authentication Server. which is a third-party server that you can download and install onto your own company's server. And that will do the same job that Facebook and Google are doing. So that's later on in the module, but if you're doing a public-facing website, then whoever you choose as your single sign-on solutions, you kind of need to pick some really big hitters. You need to think about who your users are and decide, well, will my average user have a Facebook account? Are they likely to have a LinkedIn account or a Twitter account or whatever? Now, one of the decisions that you need to make if you're implementing a single sign-on solution is you need to decide who are you going to support as your authentication providers. So we know that Strava have chosen Facebook and Google. I reckon Strava have had a meeting and they've thought about who are our average customers likely to be, where are they likely to have an account, and what should we support. And I guess they've chosen these two providers so that you have an alternative. You don't just have to have a Facebook account, but also they've not given too many options. If they'd supported 7 or 8 different sign-ons, then that might confuse the users. If you're writing an application that is going to be targeted at professionals, maybe you're doing a CV sharing application, then you'd probably choose to use something like LinkedIn as your single sign-on solution. So that would kind of be a usability decision to make. But there is another problem as well, and that is there are actually different protocols and different mechanisms for supporting this functionality. Now, if I were recording this course 4 or 5 years ago, I would have probably decided to lead on a topic called OpenID. And here is the Wikipedia page for OpenID. This is an industry protocol, and it is designed to solve the single sign-on problem. So it's a mechanism that will allow the client site to communicate with the authentication providing site and allow the two to share information. OpenID have a website. It's the openid.net site. Now, interestingly, if we go to the Get an OpenID page, and if you have a look at their list of providers that support OpenID, you might, depending on your application, be a little bit disappointed. You will notice that there's no Facebook there, there's no Twitter, and there's no LinkedIn. Google do support OpenID, although I get a general feeling that they're trying to move away from OpenID. Now, forgive me if you're a Google insider and you know better than me, but it does look like Google are kind of trying to build their own identity management system. So Google are there, and certainly some big hitters in the industry, but I would say that the major social media providers are absent. So we know then that Facebook was not present on the list of OpenID providers. Instead, Facebook have opted to go for an alternative approach. We can get a clue to what they support by hovering over the link here. If you check out down at the bottom, can you see that on my link, there is a reference there to OAuth? And actually, even though Google do support OpenID, or at least a version of OpenID, generally, they also support other mechanisms. And if I hover over the Google one, once again, there's OAuth again. So I assume you're familiar with OAuth and you're something of an expert in it because we've covered it in detail on Module 2 of this course. If you already know OAuth, then all of this is quite simple, really. When I click on this link here, we're going to initiate an OAuth process. It will be the exact same, what I call the 3-legged process. It's actually the Authorization Code grant type that we studied in detail. And once this process is complete, again, I won't actually do it. I'll do a cancel there. Once the OAuth process is complete, then this client site, Strava, can send a REST request across to Facebook. And it will ask a simple question. It will say, what is the Facebook ID for this user? As I said, just for convenience, they might also ask for the first name and last name, if it's possible to get those. Now, the ID that Facebook send back, of course, will be an ID particular to Facebook. It's going to be something like the user's Facebook ID. It might be some other token, but we do know that it will uniquely identify that user on Facebook. Well, the client site can then use that ID to register that user on their own database. Then in future, when we hit the login button here, the OAuth process will trigger automatically. Often, the user will already be logged into Facebook, so they won't need to do anything. The user will just think they've pressed login and then they're logged in. But actually, we'll have gone to the Facebook site, which will have redirected back to here. And then in future, when they hit the login button, we know that the complex OAuth process is going to happen under the hood. But for the user, assuming they're already logged into Facebook, it will all kind of feel just automatic. They'll feel like they've automatically been logged in. Now, I know that for people new to this, it can feel really odd that the client site is not going to be doing any authenticating at all. We're delegating the authentication to Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Google, or whoever. So we are putting a lot of trust into those third-party sites. We're trusting that they have securely authenticated that user, and we're trusting that when they return back to us, that they are genuinely sending a correct ID for that user. But anyway, now you know that OAuth is the mechanism for building this. If you want to supply single sign-on on your site, then you really just have to use your knowledge of OAuth to set everything up. Well, there is a slight complexity. If you wanted to use Twitter, then Twitter use OAuth 1, which of course we haven't covered on the course, but Facebook do use OAuth 2. So in theory, at least, you could go away and build a single sign-on solution right now for yourself with no further information. But there is a much easier way. There is a side project to Spring called Spring Social. And by the way, one of the lead developers of Spring Social is the well-known author Craig Walls, who you might know from his excellent Spring in Action book. And what Spring Social gives you is a set of tools to easily integrate with social media sites. So, for example, let's say you wanted to make your website be able to access a user's Facebook data. Maybe to get something like their list of friends, or perhaps you want to be able to read a user's timeline of tweets from Twitter. Then you could work really hard to look up the reference manuals on Facebook and Twitter to work out how their OAuth systems work, or you could take the easy path of using this Spring Social, which gives you a kind of a wrapper over the APIs provided by these social media sites. So Spring Social hides the slightly complex mechanism of connecting and gives us a really simple and clear API to work with. As you can see from here, Spring Social have decided it's kind of a modular system they're using here. There's a core library, but then there are extensions to Spring Social to support the different providers. So you can think of these as almost like being plugins. And at the time of recording, and I guess this could possibly change over the next few years, but the time of recording, they've decided to really invest all of their effort in what they think are the three big hitters. They've gone for Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and they have first-class support. But at the time of recording, they have incubator projects, which are sort of close to being accepted as first-class extensions. They're working on one for GitHub, and they're working on one for TripIt. But then, and this is a slight problem with working in this area, if you have a specific requirement that maybe you're building a music application, for example, and therefore you really want to support SoundCloud, integration with SoundCloud, then I'm afraid they're only supported as community projects. So these will be hosted on their own GitHub pages. And as always with these kinds of community efforts, you will be sort of taking a chance that these are supported, that they're being actively developed and all the rest of it. Now, I can tell you when you go a little further with Spring Social, it's not that difficult to make your own extensions. It's something we certainly won't be doing on this course, but it's something that you might want to consider for the future. Notice that there is an extension there for Strava if you're of an athletic bent. On this course then, I will focus on the core integrations. And remember that Spring Social goes way beyond what we need for this course. All we really need from Facebook, Twitter or LinkedIn is some kind of ID so that we can automatically log them into our site. We don't need things like their tweets or their timeline or their friends list or whatever. But I think it is worth in this chapter having at least a little bit of a play with Spring Social, just so we can see how it works. We'll just do the basics so you know what's going on. But then in the next chapter, we'll use Spring Social specifically to authenticate. In order to do the practical work on this chapter, you are going to need a Facebook account. I'm going to start with Facebook. We'll get that working first, and then we'll expand into Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm sorry if you really don't like Facebook. Of course, you could, if you don't have an account, you could easily create an account just for the purposes of this course. I know also that many of you watch these courses in corporate environments where you might not be able to access Facebook. In that case, well, I hope you're still going to get some value just by watching this video. Of course, it's a lot better if you can do the practical work with me. But if you are in that situation, then of course for you, probably the internal SSO using the central authentication service is coming up in a later chapter. That module will probably be more suitable for you. So that's out of the way. What I want to do is I want to extend our CRM system so that we have some integration with Facebook to start with. Now, in order to do anything with the Facebook APIs, and this is true of Twitter and LinkedIn and probably all the others as well, the first thing you're going to have to do is to register with those sites as a developer. Now, don't worry, this won't cost you anything and it won't have any impact on the rest of your Facebook account, or at least as long as you don't do anything illegal. Now, the reason that you have to go through this process is that in order to initiate an OAuth process with the site, with Facebook, we're going to need a client ID and a client secret. And you should be familiar with that from the OAuth part of the course. That's used in Lake 2 of OAuth. Now, if we're going to use Facebook's API, then they need to know who we are. And they're going to check that we're not doing anything on Facebook that's breaking their terms and conditions. So, of course, we won't be doing anything illegal on the course, but if you're signing up as a developer, you need to ensure that you similarly don't do anything that breaks their terms and conditions. I'll assume that you're already logged into your Facebook account. Now, I can't find any links from Facebook to this page, so you might have to manually type in the URL developers.facebook.com, and you will need to click on register. As always on these videos, I should say, this may have changed by the time you watch this video, but I would hope that the process would be something that you could work out quite easily for yourself. You might need to enter your password here. And you are expected to read and understand the Facebook platform policy and the privacy policy. And I know usually we're a bit tongue-in-cheek about these, but there are some important terms and conditions in there. If you're doing this for a company, then you would definitely be wanting your legal department to check their policies. So I will accept and click on Next. Now they're asking for verification here, and you can do this either by adding a credit card or by supplying a phone number. Of course, I realise that you might not be comfortable supplying a phone number. Unfortunately, at least at present, that's simply a requirement of working with Facebook. The send via phone call is not enabled, apparently because the functionality was buggy and they haven't got around to fixing it, would you believe? So I'm afraid that receiving an SMS message is the only option you have here if you want to register as a developer. I'm developing a website rather than a mobile phone application, so I guess I need to click website here. Really, I'm not sure if I haven't used this quick start before. I think that this might be something that they've just added recently. What we're really wanting is to create an application ID and a secret so that we can run the OAuth process. So I think if I skip and get to the create app ID, this is what we really want. So first of all, we need a display name. Now this is going to be the name that appears on the Facebook page when the user is directed to the registration for this app. So this needs to be something that is meaningful and useful to your users. I don't really have an interesting name for this, so I'm just going to go for CRM system, and I don't think that has to be unique, but you can use any display name that you like in there. We don't need a namespace, and just for Facebook's purposes, we need to choose a category in which our app lives. And I guess since this is a customer management service application, I guess this is a business application. Not very exciting, but create app ID is the important one. You might be asked to complete some capture information, and all being well, you should now be sent to the dashboard for your application. Worth noting here, note that your application is in development mode here. It'll only be visible to yourself as an administrator and a developer. And of course, if you're building a real customer-facing website, at some point you will need to go live with this application, in which case Facebook have to approve the application. We don't need to do that for this course, of course, but worth bearing in mind. What we're interested in is the app's ID and the app's secret. So keep this page open. We'll return to it later, but it's time now to go across to Spring Social and to get coding. You'll find the additional jars that you need for Spring Social in the additional jars folder. Notice there's quite a lot of them. We're going to need 7 for this course. They're very modular and really quite small jar files. We have the core of Spring Social there, together with the Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter integrations. There's also a separate jar file that just handles the integration with Spring Social and Spring Security, which of course we'll be using in the next chapter. The Spring Config jar provides us with a namespace and a few simplifications, and the web jar file is used to help us do the authentication. So you'll need all 7 of those in your lib directory, and you'll also need them on your build path. Now remember that the aim of this chapter is just really to kick the tires of Spring Social. We're going to have a little play with it and just to see what we can do. We're not going to do any authentication in this chapter, but this is going to provide some good groundwork for when we do in the next chapter. I think it would be quite nice if we could add a page to our CRM system that calls Facebook and just gets some information back from Facebook, maybe your name, email address. It would be great if we could possibly get a list of your friends from Facebook, although we'll see very shortly that there is a problem with that. It is possible, but there is a problem. Perhaps we can get your posts from your timeline. So, where do we start? Well, we're going to add a new URL to our CRM system, and that URL is going to be the entry point to kick off the OAuth process with Facebook. So I hope you're following along with me. My plan is here in the Web Controllers folder, we'll create a new class, and let's call this the Facebook Controller. As always, this is a Spring MVC controller, so we'll annotate it with @controller. So we're going to visit a page on our CRM application that shows you this Facebook data. So we'll do a request mapping and can use any URL that we like in here, but for reasons that will be obvious in a short while, I'm going to put this in a kind of folder /Facebook, and we'll call the page, it really doesn't matter, facebook.html will do for now. Now, I'm not sure if I've done this very often in Spring MVC, but this controller method is going to return a string, and I'll call the method start Facebook process. And the reason that I'm returning a string rather than the model and view that I would normally return is this method is simply going to do a redirect. It's going to redirect to Facebook. Now, I keep saying this, but I'm assuming you're familiar with OAuth and you've done the OAuth parts of this course. So we are going to be doing exactly the same flow that we did previously. It starts with leg 1, where we start with a redirect to the provider site. So that's the job that we have ahead of us in here. We could do all of that manually using normal OAuth principles, but we're wanting to use Spring Social here to help us along the way. And the starting point with Spring Social is we need an object which represents a connection factory. And the connection factory, I probably don't need to tell you, is a way of acquiring connections to Facebook. There is a class in the Spring Social library called Facebook Connection Factory. And I'm just going to declare that as a private attribute. And we'll call it factory. Now, I know that we're used to dependency injecting in Spring, and when we do things professionally in the next chapter, we will do just that. But actually, the Facebook Connection Factory is an object that you can directly instantiate with new Facebook Connection Factory. I'm sure you don't mind me doing that. We're just testing things out here. As I've said, we'll be doing this more professionally later on. And in a similar vein, you can see that the constructor of the connection factory has two parameters. No problem here at all. This is the application's ID and the application's secret. You can get these from the developer dashboard. The application ID is here. And again, I hope you don't mind. I'm just going to hard code this straight into the controller. I hope it goes without saying that really we would make that a property and we would keep it in a separate file. That's easy to do, not going to bother here. The app secret, you need to click the show button to show this, and you'll understand why I have blurred this out in post-production. Of course, you have to keep this secret. I don't know if I had to do that because, of course, I'm going to delete this application as soon as I've finished recording, but you really do want to keep this a secret. And we'll paste it into the code. And my post-production people won't be happy because they're going to have to constantly blur that out in the code. Good luck with that. Well, the point of doing all that is that we can use this connection factory to kick off the OAuth flow. If you have a look inside that factory object, well, we've got a couple of create connections which you might think are good starting points, but well, they take some scary looking parameters there. So actually, there's a method in there called get OAuth operations, and that's what's going to allow us to run the OAuth flow. That returns an object of type OAuth2 operations, and I will call the object operations. Now, if I do the imports, as usual, it's definitely worth making a note of where that class has come from. Now, although there is OAuth2 in the package name there, this has not come from the OAuth jars. This is coming from the Spring Social jars, as you can see there. As I hope you remember from the OAuth part of the course, when we make this initial request across to Facebook, we need to supply certain parameters, and these parameters are mandatory according to OAuth. The way that we set the parameters up is we instantiate an object of type OAuth2 parameters. I'm going to call them params. Again, this is a simple object that we can just instantiate using the default constructor. That should be parameters there. And again, that will need to be imported. That too is coming from Spring Social. There are two parameters that we're going to need to set here. And if you check the set methods in here, there's a few of them. The two that we're interested in is, first of all, the redirect URI. I hope you remember what this is all about. At the end of this method, we're going to redirect to Facebook, and that will allow the user to log into Facebook if they're not already. Then Facebook will do its stuff. Then Facebook needs to redirect back to our application. So here we're going to give it the URL or the URI of where we want to redirect back to. So this is going to be a URL on our domain. That's just localhost for us, localhost :8080 /CRM. And then, well, it can be any URL pattern that we like. We haven't yet invented this page. So I'm going to go for /Facebook/ let's go for return from facebook.html. If you choose something different in there, definitely remember what you've used. The other required parameter is the scope. Now, when we did scopes in OAuth, we were free to invent our scopes because we were writing the provider and the client. I think we invented a scope of read and a scope of write. In a similar way, we have to tell Facebook by calling the setScope method what data do we actually want to be accessing from Facebook. Maybe we only want their email address. Maybe we want their entire friends network. And of course, this is going to be used by Facebook to say to the user, are you really happy for this client application to really access this data? So what do we put in here? It is just a string. Now, this scope is defined by Facebook. So at this point, you have to check the Facebook documentation and find out what scopes they support. At the time of recording, the details of this are at the URL you can see here on the Facebook developers page. And here there is quite a long list of different scopes that they support. For example, if we ask for the email scope, just following that link there, this will allow our application to get access to the email address for that user. And we have a warning there that we've got to be compliant with the Facebook policies. One thing to be aware of, and this may affect us through this course, is that we are warned that even if we request this permission and the user grants that permission, they might not have an email address. People can sign up for Facebook with a phone number. And you're going to find that whenever you work with these social media providers, you have to code defensively. You might not get the data that you're expecting. So what I would like to try with our application is I would like to grab the user's email address, if possible. I'd like to get a list of their friends, if possible. And if I study this list, I can see there is a user_friend scope there. I'm also going to ask for their public profile as well. This is the first one in the list. And actually, the public profile is the default scope. And when we go forward into doing the authentication, we are going to want public profile because that's the way we get their ID. But if we want their first name, last name, and so on, then you have to ask for public profile. I'm also going to try on this recording. I don't know if it's going to work, but we're going to try to see if we can get the user's posts. So there's another scope right there. And of course, you can experiment with the other scopes as well. Now, this is going to be a comma-separated list. So if I can remember, I would like to try to get their email. I'd like to get their public_profile. I'd like to get their user_friends. And I'd like to try to get their user_posts. So that's how the scope works. We now just need to redirect to Facebook. Now, of course, we could go and check the documentation and find out what the URL that we need to... Well, don't worry, because that's all going to be handled by Spring Social. What we can do now is we can call a method on the operations object, which I don't think we've used so far. There is a method in there called build authorize URL, and it's the authorize URL that we need here. And we pass into that the params that we've just built. And this is going to return a string, and that string will be the URL that we need to redirect to. Now, what we could do before we kick this off, just as a sanity check, I am going to print out the URL is, and just to make things compile, for the moment, we're going to return null from there. That's just going to render a blank page. Now, before we run this, a problem is at the moment in the CRM security config, we have things set up in our HTTP patterns so that all URLs we have to be logged into a particular role. Now for this testing, I don't want to be logging in order to play with Facebook. So that's the reason why I used a folder. So we'll set up Facebook /*, and we'll give access to be permit all. Of course, in the next chapter, we'll need to think about how we're going to handle all of that. But that should be enough to at least give things a try. Let's deploy. Now, I still have the LDAP server running from the previous chapter. I think I will remove that at some point because it might get in the way of this work. But it looks like that's deploying okay. So we want to visit this new URL that we've built, /facebook.html. So I'm not expecting anything to happen there. We have a 404. That's as a result of returning the null. And it's not that easy to read here in the log, but can you see here that we have a URL and it is a HTTPS. Of course, that's necessary in OAuth. And there we are. We have a Facebook URL, which has got our client ID. The response type is code, so we can see that it is indeed running the full authorization code grant type. We have a redirect URL and the scopes. We'll get rid of the system out print line, and in Spring MVC, if we just return a redirect : followed by that URL, then it will send a redirect back to the browser. Okay, so just a case of going back to that URL, reissuing it, and we see a big difference this time. This is kind of looking good. We have landed on the Facebook page exactly as we wanted. I'm already logged into Facebook. If you were not logged into Facebook, then you might have been asked to log in there, although I'm not sure because we are seeing an error. And the error is saying that the URL, and it actually means the redirect URL that we've sent, is not recognized by this application. Now, this is a security feature of Facebook, and you'll find that a lot of the other providers do the same thing, where they maintain effectively a whitelist, a list of permissible redirect URLs. The reason that they do that is to prevent attacks where malicious clients try to get redirects back to their domain. So it looks like we've got to do some further work, and we do, and you might find that you just get trapped at that point. So if you go back to your developer's dashboard, we're probably going to have to do some work in here. As always, this may have changed by the time you watch this, but you should be able to find somewhere in here a list of redirect URLs that you can edit. It's currently under Settings and then Advanced. We'll go down a little bit. Well, I can see a white list there, but that doesn't look quite like what I'm looking for. Down here, we have valid OAuth redirect URIs. Exactly what we want. And we're going to need to paste in exactly the URI that we have here. So we get that in, and then it's going to be a save. Yeah, we can save the changes just to check that that save has applied, and yes, there it is. So we can go back to our app now. I guess I can recreate the URL here manually. So let's try this process again. Well, big difference this time. It's the kind of thing that we were hoping for. It's asking me, do I want to continue? It's warning me what kinds of things that I'm being asked to share with this other website. A couple of warnings here. The first warning is just because I'm recording in a small window, and we don't really need to worry about that. And also that some of the permissions that we're asking for have not been approved for use by Facebook. So as I mentioned before, when you make this application live, if you do, then it will have to be submitted for review. We don't need to worry about that here on this course. If I click OK, now we should be redirected back to our site. And we are. So let's check the URL that was redirected back to. That looks exactly right. Return from facebook.html. And there you can see in the parameters, there is a code. you'll be familiar with this from OAuth. That is the authorization code. It is not the access token. The access token is always kept private and would never appear in URLs. The authorization code is that code that's given back to our app after we've completed leg 1. So we have our user authenticated. The next job is leg 2, where we need to authenticate the client itself. Our client needs to log in. Now you might be thinking there's a lot of work ahead here, but again, Spring Social is going to help us do this really quite easily. So we need to build a new request mapping, and this one is going to be for our redirect URI. That will be Facebook/return from Facebook.html. In this one, I am going to be returning a model and view, because you're going to see that we can do legs 2 and 3 here in one method. So the end result of this method is going to be a page that the user can see, and it's going to contain data from Facebook, or at least we hope so. I'll call this method get data from Facebook. Just importing model and view there. To initiate leg 2 of the OAuth process, we're going to follow quite a similar process to leg 1 here. We need to get hold of this OAuth 2 operations object again. In exactly the same way. The difference this time is we're going to call the method in there called exchange for access, which at first glance is not the most understandable method name that you've ever heard, but really this method means do leg 2 of the process. Leg 2 is where we send the client secret, the client ID, and we also have to send the redirect URI again across to Facebook. This is really to convince Facebook that this whole application is who it says it is. And you'll remember that that's to prevent rogue third-party applications pretending to be our CRM system. So what we need to do in this exchange for access is we need to send the authorization code and the redirect URI in these parameters here. The first parameter, well, I haven't attached the Java docs, so it might not be clear, but you can check the Java docs for yourself, but I can tell you that the first parameter we need to send is the authorization code, and that's the code that was returned back here. So we can get hold of that very easily. I'll declare a variable called authorization code in the parameters, standard Spring MVC this. If I add in the @request_param annotation, that will take whatever was in the code parameter and it will turn it into that variable. I'll just need to import request param. That gets us the authorization code. The second parameter, as I said, is going to be the redirect URI. Now, I talked at length about this in the OAuth section of the course. There's no functional purpose in passing this redirect URI because it's not going to be used by Facebook at this stage. It's already used it in step 1. It does this as a security check. The third parameter is just if we want to pass any additional parameters across. In fact, we don't, so you can pass in a null as the third parameter there. What that's going to do is it's going to return an access token. Actually, in the API here, the return type is declared as being this object called access grant, which is just a kind of a wrapper around the access token. So we'll declare an access grant. I don't really know what to call the object, so let's call it access grant. That will need to be imported. So that, and I think I'll put a comment on here, has effectively completed leg 2 of the operations. And because that's going to be done via a REST request, we don't need to create a separate method to do leg 3. And well, I forgot there is one hoop we have to jump through first. Before we can start calling the API, we have to get hold of an object representing a connection with Facebook. We do that through the connection factory, perhaps not surprisingly. Remember earlier I pointed out there is a method there called create connection, but it needs data. And we're happy now because the parameter required here is that access grant object. By passing in the access grant into create connection, that's going to return me an object of type connection. Well, the way that the API works here is that they've created a generic class called connection, and that takes in the generic, in the angle brackets, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and any of those extensions. So we're going to be declaring here a connection to Facebook, which we will call connection. Be very careful on the importing here, because of course there's loads of connections in the jars that we've got. You want to be searching for the one from Spring Social. But now this is where the fun starts. On this connection, you'll find in here a collection of methods. I think of this really as a two-layer API. And at the top layer is basically what you're seeing in the methods here. These are the kinds of methods that you would expect to see supported really by any social media provider, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, SoundCloud, Wikipedia, or whatever. And the big method in here is the fetch user profile. Notice it's not called fetch Facebook profile, it's user profile. And you can expect this method to work, as I say, regardless of which platform you're calling. And if we have a look inside there are methods such as email, first name, last name, username, and so on. Now, I must stress, I know I've mentioned this a little bit so far, but you can't guarantee that any of these are necessarily going to work. It depends on several factors, but the main ones would be, does the social media platform actually support this particular property? Twitter, for example, I don't think we're going to get the first name from Twitter because you just have a handle on Twitter. And it might also be that there's some kind of privacy restriction which prevents these methods from returning anything. The story is you would have to experiment with these methods and see what kind of data you get back. Let's see if we can get the email for this user back. Now that's just going to be a string, I guess. Yeah. Now, this isn't a web development course, so I think on reflection, I'm not going to bother building a web page here. You could do that really trivially. I'm going to cop out really. I'm just going to do a system out print line to the console, a few blank lines, and that email. And if you return a null when you're expecting a model and view, then you will get back just a blank page on the browser. But we can check that in the console. Just for illustration, I genuinely here, because it's a while since I've experimented with this, I genuinely don't know if the connection.getDisplayName is going to work. I could try something else. We could try... That, by the way, was a top-level method. You don't need to drill into the user profile. But let's see what else is in the fetch user profile. There is a username there. Now, again, I don't know if we have a username as part of Facebook. Let's try outputting them. Do the email there. Hope you're trying this for yourself. And then the username. Okay, so let's see what happens when we give that a deploy. Now, I think if you try to refresh or reuse the URL that you currently have in your browser, I think you probably will get an exception. It's a 400 bad request. I don't know if there's anything in the console to give us information about that. Yeah, there is actually. We can see here this is the REST response that has come back from Facebook, or the JSON response. This authorization code has expired. So I hope you kind of expect that. That was a stale authorization code. We have to run through the process again. So you want to clear the URL and get back to the starting point, facebook.html. However, this time, because we have logged in on Facebook and we have given our permission for these scopes, if you were to add a further scope in, then you would be asked permission again, but we're not. So this time, notice we didn't even see Facebook there. We haven't felt any Facebook involved in that process. But we do have a new authorization code, and that possibly means we have interesting information in the log. This stat trace is just from the previous. We can see we do have an email address. It did return a name, but it did not return a username. So clearly Facebook doesn't support usernames. Well, that's fantastic. It's a really good start, but I said there's two levels of API here. Now, of everything we've seen on this connection, kind of generic things that you would expect any social media to provide, but I might want to get a list of posts on my timeline. Now, clearly, not all social media providers provide that, so you're not going to find that directly on the connection object. But what you will find on the connection is a get API method. And notice this returns an object of type Facebook. That's what the generic was there for. Of course, if we were working with Twitter, then we would be returned a Twitter object here. And the idea of this is if we want to, if we need to, we can drill down into the specific features offered by that specific framework. So on Facebook, if we have a poke around inside there, there is a method called feed operations. I think it's called the timeline now on the public side of Facebook, but they call it the feed internally. And I can call the get feed method. I know that this returns a list of post objects. And we'll need to import. Be careful here because LinkedIn also has posts, a very different type of post to Facebook's. And of course, we'll need the Java util list. And we can now iterate around those posts, a regular for each. And for each post, well, what's inside the post? Well, there's various get methods which you can experiment with. Get a picture, get a story. Oh, I don't know. It's a huge API, but there is definitely a get message in there. So again, I'm only going to output this to the console. So again, as I deploy this, I will remind you that this will only work if everything is sort of in place. It could be that the posts on the timeline, they just don't have the right privacy settings to be returned by the API. So you're always dependent on that. Okay, so again, we'll need to resubmit the original URL. And well, we have some data. I'm not a heavy Facebook user, so I posted that about an hour ago just to make sure I had some useful data coming back. As I said, you can't necessarily guarantee you're going to get exactly what you want here. And a good example, I'll just round off this section with this final example. You might think, well, it would be great if we could get a list of all of your friends. And although I'm not a heavy Facebook user, I do have at least one friend on my Facebook account. And you can poke your way through the API, but there is a friend operations on that Facebook object. And we should be able to call get friend profiles looks like a good possibility. And that is going to return a list of user objects. So usual imports, the user from Facebook, and another for each. And for each of them, I don't know if there's a string defined on there. Clearly things like birthdays and emails will depend on privacy settings. I would expect at the very least there would be an ID for each user. So let's try that. Okay, so same as before. Well, no exceptions. Now, I promise you, I do have friends on Facebook, but no friends are being returned. And it's not that the getID method isn't returning anything. It's just that there are no entries in this list at all. I'm not getting a list of blanks. Now, I think the reason for this is a security restriction on Facebook. The restriction is that it's only going to return friends who happen to also use this application. So of course we're in development mode, so there's no chance that anybody's going to be a user of this application, so I'm going to get no data returned. Now obviously that's not really part of this course, we're here for security, and the music at last is playing, so it's time to move on. But I hope I've given you a good feeling for what Spring Social can do, but also the limitations of working with these third-party social media providers. In the next chapter, we're going to be moving on. We won't be doing any more of this. This was just a bit of fun. Really, all we want back from the likes of Facebook, LinkedIn and Twitter is some kind of unique identifier so we know who the user is. There is quite a lot of work to do to integrate this with Spring Security, but we'll attack that after a good break. See you then.